For interviews on educational technology and for a list of our educational technology workshops, please visit www.edtechlive.com. And for discounted Dell computers, please visit our sponsor, www.k12computers.com.
I think we're in a lot of ways, a period of the most profound reinvention of sort of education and how people need to learn since the invention of literacy. Yeah, I actually have to say I've often been skeptical of formal education because most of the really interesting people that I know have achieved their education in spite of their formal training, not because of it. And the whole participatory culture that's growing up around Web 2.0, is profoundly engaging. It's way more exciting to produce than it is to consume.
Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to EdTech Live. Today is Thursday, April 26, 2007, and my guest today is Tim O'Reilly. Tim, thanks so much for being here.
You're very welcome.
I think that you're going to have some things to say which will be of great interest. Would it be fair to say that our perception of the use of the web, and say in the 1990s, reflected the culture that we had for learning, and that what we're seeing in terms of Web 2.0 or the read-write web is an evolution that is actually harnessing the power of the web that was inherent but that maybe we didn't recognize?
I think the real issue that we have to be thinking about is that a market like education is a formalization of ideas about what people ought to know. But at the end of the day, people figure out for themselves what they need to know. And in a lot of ways, what's happening with Web 2.0 is that sort of a set of functions that we thought we knew how they worked in society are being reinvented from the bottom up. As people just find their own new pathways to learning, to doing things, to finding things out. And I think the formal education systems just haven't even begun to catch up with the new processes. And we've seen in a lot of ways, we saw this starting just in our book business years ago. The typical O'Reilly technology book customer is somebody who's self-taught. Versus some of our publishing competitors, they were really sort of much more tied into the academic system and how was computer science taught. And they were just missing a lot of topics because they weren't ever taught in schools. They were just sort of bottom up from people talking to each other. Well, that kind of behavior spread from the early adopters in the technology industry to mainstream culture. As we built new mechanisms for people to acquire knowledge, to use knowledge, to reuse it, to share it, they just started doing it. And I think we're in a lot of ways, a period of the most profound reinvention of sort of education and how people need to learn since the invention of literacy. And I think that that sounds like a pretty exaggerated statement. But the fact is that there's an increasing number of topics on which, when you need to know something, you can find out almost instantly what the answer is. And that places much less of a premium on having a body of knowledge already accumulated, and much more of a premium on first of all, being able to find out what you need to know, but also in having a mental model of how the world works that lets you figure out, what's important. In some ways, the digital divide today, leaving aside the rhetoric of the digital divide, people have access to computers. The digital divide is between people who know how to think about search and those who don't. People who know how to figure out where a community of interest gathers and where the sort of the current hot information is being shared, and those who don't. So you have and you also have new mechanisms for sort of community knowledge to be communicated. I think it was a great post recently by somebody who compared Digg and the like to the waggling of bees who found a new food source. They come back and do this little waggle dance, and users are now doing that on Delicious and Digg. Hey, I found something cool and new, and the other bees follow. And so there's that sort of hive intelligence aspect. But that depends on knowing which bees you follow. I talk about a big part of my business being watching the alpha geeks. That means figuring out, these people are good predictors. They're bees whose waggle dance is important. I'm going to follow them because it's going to lead me somewhere interesting.
Maybe there's a book there, because I've thought that, for a long time I've thought that the way that ants communicate, where one ant connects with another ant and somehow knowledge is passed between those two ants that turns into collective knowledge. So maybe it's the bees and the ants together.
Well, there is a book. Stephen Johnson's Emergence covered that topic pretty well.
Oh, then I should maybe not. I should stop talking there. Well, I think one of the things that we've noticed in our family is that the web has significantly in the last few years changed our learning experiences at home. When we watch a movie or we read a book, we immediately go to Wikipedia or we go to the web and we look it up and we discuss, and then we find other resources, and we oftentimes will end up finding another book or another movie because of it.
That's right.
If the school model that we have now is really based on an industrial factory production model that reflected the desires of the business leaders in the country to have employees educated in a certain way, do you think that we're going to see a similar drive by business to change education?
Yeah, I actually have to say I've often been skeptical of formal education because most of the really interesting people that I know have achieved their education in spite of their formal training, not because of it. Particularly in the computer industry, the kind of creativity you see, often comes from people who came at things from a very different background. Now, that's not to say they didn't have formal educational training, but it wasn't in the area where they had an impact. Larry Wall, the creator of Perl, was a linguist. He wasn't a computer scientist. For that matter, I was trained in Greek and Latin classics. I wasn't a computer person. So that ability to take some body of knowledge that you've learned and apply it in a new area where you're forging your own path, where you're thinking about a topic freshly, I think is incredibly important. It always has been important, but we go through periods where it's undervalued. Where, okay, we figured it out, now we'll systematize and we'll get lots more people who know how to do the same thing. But in fact, most periods of industrial and cultural renaissance begin with inspired amateurs, people who don't have any formal training, who are making it up as they go along. And this is just the latest round of that. Now, what that would suggest, though, is that eventually the skills of the pioneers will end up getting systematized. That there will be a set of skills that can be taught, and the question then is how can we teach those skills more effectively, particularly if they are skills of practice rather than of rote learning. And one of the things I guess we've been thinking a lot about at O'Reilly. If you look at our Head First series of books, which are really about a new approach to learning, or what we're doing with the O'Reilly Institute of Technology, we're really trying to ask ourselves, how do you get better at getting people engaged with the act of learning, with the excitement of trying new things. And I think one of the big shifts we're seeing is, is the need to construct systems of education that are based on doing things. And that's also kind of what's happening with Make Magazine. We're kind of seeing this sort of renewed interest in the workshop. When I look at education over the last 50 or 60 years, one of the really thought-provoking statements that certainly shaped my thinking came from a sort of well-known astronomer named Philip Morrison, via a friend of mine. And Philip apparently said, when I was growing up, we all knew how to fix the tractor. And what was really exciting in education was to learn the theory. He says, now we have a generation of people who've learned nothing but theory, and they don't know how to do things anymore. And so we actually need to go back to, to hands-on education. And that's something we're really seeing very powerfully. And hands-on might be, kind of the exploratory learning that you're talking about, where people hear about a topic and they start sort of searching the web, reading, following conversations. But it might also be literally doing things. At the heart of the O'Reilly Institute, courses, in computer science is a sandbox where people can actually try things, in a guided environment with a tutor. In Head First, it's sort of what we call brain-friendly exercises, things that get you more engaged, where we're really trying to find what is it that sparks that creative engagement with practice, with doing things, as opposed to just sort of imbibing information and somehow filing it away.
I interviewed John C.D. Brown, and I think he was talking about the same thing when he talked about the fact that Web 2.0 has brought back the ability for students to tinker.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another really important part of if you look at the trend in Web 2.0, it's to make the process of interacting with computers easier and easier. It started with the personal computer, but the personal computer eventually became fairly static. Web 2.0 was sort of, let's go back at some of these applications in a fresh way that allows for more engagement. And the whole participatory culture that's growing up around Web 2.0, is profoundly engaging. It's way more exciting to produce than it is to consume. And when people feel that they can make an impact, that's hugely engaging. When somebody can say, wow, I posted a story to Dig and it made it to the front page. I got 3,400 digs. All these other people thought that this thing I noticed was important. Or when somebody can say, I made the up-to-date entry, in Wikipedia about the shootings at Virginia Tech. I was part of a piece of history and recording that history. That's incredibly exciting and engaging.
It seems to me that MySpace, for all its warts, reflects the ability to get attention and to create at the same time.
Yeah.
And that the two of us together are producing just this steamroller of interest in youth. I would guess that, aside from my Latin class in 7th grade, that I rarely actually produce material that other people, my peers, saw. Mm-hmm. And yet kids growing up today post comments on photos, put up a MySpace account, are engaged in all kinds of activities where they're actively producing material that's being seen by others.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Well, I guess if I think back to my own, say, high school career, some of the most exciting things, that I did were in that realm of creating products that were seen by others. Being an editor and a columnist for the school newspaper, being an actor in plays. That's an exciting thing to share what you do and what you see. And but I guess I would say that it's sort of it's probably somewhat overstated to say that, Web 2.0 or, open source or whatever it is makes this all new. There have always been these impulses in people. There have always been outlets for these impulses. I was just listening on the radio to some of the interviews with David, what's the name of the guy who was just killed in a car crash? Famous reporter, David Halberstam. And just his description of how he was involved in sort of reporting on the civil rights movement, and how his aspiration to be a reporter, and that he was able to grow up to be a part of history. I go, that's an impulse that's been around. We've probably democratized opportunities for that, but I guess I would have to say that we're in this new formative period. And it's really important not to generalize too much from a formative period. There was a period when, say, I don't know, rock and roll was taking off, and you could, everybody thought that, wow, you can make an impact, you can be engaged with your life, you can shape the world by, creating music, and it was true, but it wasn't equally true for everyone. When a new technology like blogging comes along, everybody says, wow, open playing field. We can do whatever we want. We can make an impact. We can show who we are, but eventually there's the top 100 blogs. There are the people on MySpace who have, 10,000 friends, and there's people on MySpace who have 30 friends. So all I can say is it's really important to get that their basic human impulses, they get sort of channeled, repressed, boxed in. They find a new way out. And if we're really trying to think about education, what we have to think about is what's today's way out? Where is the opportunity for people to shine? And more than that, what is, given that there's a range of opportunities, how do we value them? And how do we support them? And how do we create a richer menu for kids to choose from? So that, for example, there's one, set of kids who say, my route to self-expression and excitement is through basketball or soccer. There's another group that says, my route to self-expression is through building cool kill robots. Another one says, my route is through music. And this has always been, sort of the menu, but those things are not always equally valued, and we haven't always figured out sort of how to give them their sort of contemporary expression. So again, kind of going back to music, and the lag that tends to happen in the education system. When every kid, wanted to be a rock musician, how many schools were offering support for that? No, you could be in the band playing, march music, from 30 or 40 years before, and today, just look at the excitement that's happening with computers, and, if there's a computer class in school, it's teaching BASIC, which is something that, I don't know if they're probably not teaching BASIC anymore now. Maybe they're teaching Java, so they're only 10 years behind rather than 20, right? But, the problem is the inertial lag in the education system that makes it out of step with the contemporary expressions of possibility for students.
Yeah, we've certainly, I've noticed two trends in education that maybe reflect part of what you're saying. One is that until educators actually use some of these tools of the Web 2.0, they have a hard time understanding exactly what's taking place.
Yeah.
And once they do, there's a very interesting sort of cycle that takes place. They become so engaged and excited that they're willing to actually kind of look at education with sort of fresh eyes and start to ask questions that a small minority have asked for a long time, but now sort of becomes a growing number of people who say, why isn't education more engaging? Or why aren't we doing these things? The second difficult aspect, I think, right now is that there's a sort of a societal sense that we've already spent a lot of money on educational technology and it hasn't worked. How do you respond to that? And from your business perspective, what would you say to that?
Well, I tend to agree that spending on educational technology is a bad idea. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say there are places where access to technology would really help and matter. But I'll tell you, if there's one thing that I believe you could do to make better experiences in K-12 education, it's smaller class sizes, period. More interaction with passionate adults, who have enough time and ability to focus on the kids. Second thing I would say is, you probably have to get rid of some of the unionized seniority among teachers because you need fresh blood. If you really want to be in touch with the living currents of society, you need teachers who often are new to it, and also where the best can rise to the top rather than the most senior can rise to the top and get the best jobs. And that has nothing to do with technology.
Well, I interviewed a guy named Mike Russell from Boston College, and one of the interesting statistics that has come out of his research is that the newer teachers are actually using technology, the transformative technologies, less in the classroom. And he sees sort of a larger systemic issue with regard to how we train teachers.
Yeah.
Certainly difficult issues and not easy to quantify. Although I am intrigued by your response because I see some of these Web 2.0 technologies being so transformative that I do want to see them used more ubiquitously in the classroom. And I do think that we've sort of we've spent a lot of money on technology not knowing actually how to integrate it. And so we're left feeling as though we've spent all this money and it didn't work without realizing that we didn't actually allow it to transform what we're doing.
Right. Yeah.
So one of the things that the educational bloggers are experiencing is, I think, what you described. More and more people being involved, and so sort of a smaller group of people with a greater amount of voice. And it seems that there's a balance between the ability to express yourself and be heard by a lot of people and just being involved in engaged conversations.
Yeah.
And so one of the benefits that I think we're seeing from Web 2.0 is the ability to actually connect in smaller ways. You may not be the largest voice in the blogosphere.
Yeah.
But you actually can connect with people all over the world in engaging ways.
Well, I mean, obviously that's true, and that was one of the first and most important lessons of open source. It was not actually opening the source code. It was that a guy from Finland and a guy from Wales could get together and work on a shared project, namely the Linux kernel, right? And Linus Torvalds and Alan Cox. It was like, wow, people from all over the world who had a common interest could find each other, could connect, and could work together. And and that trend, which started to show up first in open source, is now in full flower in sites like Wikipedia or Dig or for that matter in MySpace, where people who have common interests are able to connect and work together. We still have a long way to go to find ways that they can work together effectively. I think that people haven't really learned what works. Like a lot of people, for example, look at Wikipedia and they go, "Oh, great, we can throw up a wiki," but they don't realize how much work goes into making Wikipedia work. I mean, first of all, it's already a structured set of pages, where the expectations about what goes into an entry. There's expectations about how people will comport themselves. There's a discussion associated with every page, potentially. There's a lot of structure there, and there are people who've gotten involved in maintaining and moderating that structure. So I think that one of the, similarly, if you look at open source software projects, there's always the people who say, wow, we can just throw something up there and make it open source, and some magic will happen. In fact, an effective open source project takes a lot of work. So figuring out how to build community, how to build shared practice is hard, and if that is in fact one of the things that ought to be taught. When you want to accomplish a shared goal, how do you get people to sign up to work with you? How do you manage a community effectively? How do you deal with dissent? How do you manage projects to completion so that they don't, end up, dying at 70 or 80%?
Interesting. How much do you think that what we're seeing of Web 2.0 has been informed by the philosophy of open source?
Well, I think that there's really two aspects. I think there is at least a philosophical sort of leaning towards the idea of openness and the idea of sharing. But as I argued in my paper, The Open Source Paradigm Shift, the fundamental dynamic of Web 2.0 is actually antithetical to the ideals of open source. And people haven't seen this yet, but they will. And the way I mean that is that it's really driven by what Clayton Christensen called the law of conservation of attractive profits. And in business, people are always trying to figure out where they're going to make their money. And when something becomes cheap, something else becomes valuable. And so, I spent a lot of time in my thinking about Web 2.0 thinking about the real implications of open source and drawing a lot from the history of the IBM PC. Because in a lot of ways, the PC was almost open source hardware. It was a huge change in the structure of the computer industry. Here there were people who, companies whose business model was focused on the idea that you had absolute control over your hardware. And IBM broke that model without meaning to when they released this personal computer where the specs were published and anybody could make them. And the net result of that was that hardware became much less valuable. As the commodity model of the personal computer took over, all the margin went out of hardware. But value didn't go away. It migrated to software. Software became very valuable and very proprietary. And, so we saw effectively a huge shift of power from IBM to Microsoft because Microsoft realized that they could concentrate economic value and attractive profits in software, whereas IBM was still thinking hardware. So I looked at that situation. I said, the same thing's actually happening with open source. A lot of people imagined, they simply imagined, we will substitute open source software for Microsoft software, and that'd be great. We'll have everything be free and open. And I said, no, actually, what's really going to happen is we're going to commoditize software, just like the hardware used to be commoditized, and something else will become valuable, and it will be dominated by companies that are working on extracting that value. Now, my thesis was that would come in the form of databases that got better the more people use them, that harness network effects to create proprietary data value. And so we're seeing this today with companies like Google. Now, Google is still sort of talking and thinking a lot about openness, and they're working to try to keep a balance. But you're already starting to see, that backlash as people say, whoa, Google is getting more and more valuable. They're getting more and more powerful. They have more and more data that they own that they're using for their benefit and nobody else's. And, that process is well underway. And so I think what's going to happen as a result of all of this openness is we're actually, in all of our sharing, we're actually contributing to the increase of power of large, new companies that are figuring out how to harness and collect our intelligence. And that power will be, I would hope, will largely be used for good, but sometimes it will be used for evil, so to speak. And I guess the way I see it is this alternating cycle in which things become opened up, and that creates opportunities for innovation, for new markets, for entrepreneurship. But then the market consolidates, and it becomes much harder for new entrants. And the power goes to incumbents who become increasingly powerful. But as they become powerful, they tend to exert more control over the marketplace until it becomes stagnant. And then that human impulse to create breaks out again somewhere else, and then the story repeats. And so, I'm just looking at this in the computer industry, but you see it in every industry. Somebody basically has a breakthrough that upsets the apple cart, and the scramble for innovation and new opportunities begins again until somebody figures out the secret sauce, and then the market starts to consolidate again. And I think the same will happen with Web 2.0. And so we are in this stage, which is going to go on for another 10 years, where this whole idea of harnessing collective intelligence is going to be incredibly exciting. But the net result is going to be a very, very different world in which there's a huge amount of power that belongs to people who have these massive databases in which this collective intelligence has been collected.
I remember at one point you were saying something like, we need a Richard Stallman for protecting the right to your data.
No, I haven't said we need one. I said we will get one. Right? I think that there will be that moment when there is the wake-up call where people realize that it's not free software that we need, it is free data. And we started to see people talking about that and raising awareness of it. But in a way, it's not clear that it necessarily needs to come from a revolt, if you like. The IBM PC wasn't. It was actually introduced by the dominant monopolist. They just didn't realize what they were doing. Whereas the free and open source movement, some people trace it back to Richard Stallman, and I think Richard certainly played an important role in sort of theorizing the importance. But what really made, I think, open source take off was the internet. It was the ability of people to connect, and it really broke the model because network-oriented software needs to be standardized. It's very, very hard to have proprietary networking software unless you have dominant market share. And the only company that really got there was Cisco at a very low level. Everybody else ended up, having to create software that interoperated.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, this period of time right now of enormous creativity where 2 or 3 people can build a Web 2.0 application that almost instantaneously goes around the world may come to an end as the sheer volume is hard to keep track of, and the larger, more established players actually can fold that into their existing data structures?
Well, it's not just that they can fold it into their existing data. It's that it's inevitable that they will. So the value that, just name me a Web 2.0 site that you think about.
Flickr.
Okay, so here's Flickr. It gets better because people put their photos there. People tag the photos. People, use comments on the photos. Flickr has figured out how to create network effects in which it's better to participate in Flickr than it is to keep your photos to yourself. All right? So Flickr gains power as a result. They become the repository that's more valuable than the standalone application. Right? It's not sort of that they set out to, to take that power.
Yeah, I mean, Flickr's a great example for me because it has the capability to actually identify and block out individuals and say a family history photograph is really not reproducible anywhere else. that all of our relatives can look at one place and can actually update the photograph by indicating who an individual is pretty powerful. And I've said several times, I'm now locked into Flickr.
Yeah,
I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah, I definitely agree that is one of the ways that companies can actually encourage that network effect is by that promise of openness. And in fact, when I talk to companies about do they need to have proprietary software, I say no. Actually, open source becomes a natural ally if you really have a true network effects business. All right? If your system really is better because of the number of people who use it, then you can give stuff away all you want. People don't. A lot of people have tried to start another eBay, but it's very hard. A lot of people have tried to start another Craigslist. It's very hard, and it isn't their advantage. Isn't because they have a lock-in, other than the natural lock-in of a network effect.
Are there technologies that you're watching that you really think are going to have significant impact that we haven't figured out yet?
Oh, absolutely. I think the biggest changes that I see on the horizon are, first off, that we right now are in the era where a lot of the collective intelligence applications are driven by people sitting at keyboards typing away. Whether it's Google collecting link data from the web or search query data, or whether it's people building their Facebook profiles, or even when they're uploading their photos to Flickr. But what happens when data is collected automatically? I think this is one of the biggest frontiers. We are all going to be sensor enabled over the next 4 or 5 years. It's already happening. For example, there's a startup in the UK called Path Intelligence that has built applications for shopping malls to track foot traffic. And what they're doing is they're just looking at there's a little data signature that's sent out by a cell phone when it contacts the cell tower. Just apparently the phones check in, they phone home periodically, and by just tracking those signals, Path Intelligence can say, okay, 300 people came to this store today, 500 people came to this store. And that solves a long-standing problem for shopping malls because their rent is actually often based on the foot traffic for a particular location. I didn't know this, but until I talked to these guys. But so here's something: we're all carrying cell phones. Well, what other applications are there for that kind of data tracking? People focus on things like RFID. We don't need RFID. We have our cell phones. When the cell phone becomes the electronic credit card and wallet, what will happen? Right now, our credit card companies and our cell phone companies haven't figured out Web 2.0. They're collecting all this data, but it's still in some kind of back office, and maybe they do some data mining against it. But they haven't figured out what Google has figured out, how to connect the back office into a live application that's almost responsive and doing things as a result of what we do. And I guess I would say that what is going to happen, I love Microsoft's name. It's actually way better than Web 2.0, except they only use it to describe their own software, live software, because that's a big part of what we're building. We're building these software engines and applications that learn interactively from their users in real time. And to me, there's a huge opportunity which is going to be embraced when other big data collectors, whether it's let's say credit cards and banks and phone companies are among the most obvious, but really anybody, for example, with a supply chain might be looking at it this way. Supermarkets with loyalty cards. insurance companies. Think about insurance companies with increasing numbers of GPS-enabled cars attached to their insurance systems. Norwich Union in the UK already has pay-as-you-drive insurance, based on your GPS data being phoned home. That world of ubiquitous tracking of data that's being thrown off by the sensors we carry around with us and the interactions we have with an increasingly electronically infused world is going to be a huge transformation. So I think what's going to happen right now is we're going to see this Web 2.0 world, which is still largely mediated by by computers, being replaced by a world that's much more mediated by the multifunction smart cell phone and potentially by other, connected devices that we carry around with us.
So this is for those who don't know, this would sort of be the corollary to what happens at Amazon, but in a physical way. That we move through Amazon and all of that gets tracked.
Yeah.
Correlate, and you're saying that can actually take place in the physical world based on the cell phone that we carry around.
Absolutely, and not just a cell phone. I think it's certainly possible that at some point we really will have some breakthroughs with wearable computing. Somebody will introduce some killer device that really is ubiquitous, and whether it's a particular style of heads-up display or you see little signs of other types of interaction with computers than keyboards cropping up. Again, I'm integrating a lot of different data points here, and they may or may not come together in the way that we imagine. But I think, for example, the Nintendo Wii with its inertial controller is really significant, as is just sort of the increasing number of other cheap inertial controllers that are being put into things. Again, that sort of suggests that we're going to get to a point where gestural interfaces are more meaningful. Speech recognition is becoming really practical. I believe Nuance does a really killer demo in which they have the world's fastest thumb typist racing against somebody using speech recognition software on phone. Speech recognition is really getting there. I just recently did a blog post about why I think Google is offering 411 service. I think it's to collect the speech data.
Yeah, it made me think completely differently about all that I was doing with that post of yours. Are you a fan of Wikipedia?
I am.
Are you a fan of Second Life?
I am a conceptual fan of Second Life. I really believe that the idea of Second Life is really important. It's this idea of that we can create immersive virtual worlds that are data spaces that are really not necessarily sort of directed entertainment. I think in practice, Second Life has a long way to go.
Are there particular Web 2.0 tools that you use during your regular workday that you really like?
It's an interesting question.
Do you use Twitter?
I use Twitter a little bit. I'm not. I think Twitter is significant. I actually am more a user of Jaiku, but that's maybe partly because I'm friends with the founder. And Jaiku is also a cell phone technology as well as it actually it's very similar to Twitter, but it started on the phone rather than starting on the web and then going to the phone. I like that a lot. We also something we're using in our conferences that I think is really cool. There's a site called Moses that lets you sort of manage SMS pretty easily. So, for example, we let the audience sort of vote on presentations by sending SMS messages to Moses. That's pretty exciting. We do a lot of homegrown work with data warehousing of information that we mine from the marketplace. That's really not stuff that's publicly available, but it's very much Web 2.0, where we're gathering information about people, trends. We have in our data warehouse we have something like 65 million online job postings, I don't know how many tens of millions of blog postings, and we use that. We have a bunch of tools for searching and visualizing trends based on that. I use that stuff a lot. In terms of sort of publicly facing, Web 2.0 services, I'm very fond of Last.fm for music. It's a collective intelligence service for music. Recommendations. What I particularly like about Last.fm is also it's a great demonstration of this sensor network idea. Where literally they, rather than asking you anything about your taste, they just install a little plug-in. They watch what you listen to, and use it then to inform what they recommend to you. So, and I think that style of data gathering is going to become much more commonplace. I think I don't actually use it. I don't have enough time for using it, but I like StumbleUpon. StumbleUpon is a Firefox add-on that basically lets you just do some random walks around topics. I've been pretty impressed with Spock, which is the new people search engine. I think that it has a long way to go, but it will be really interesting. If they can pull off even half of what they hope to do. Right now, managing and thinking about people is a fairly critical sort of axis that we haven't done a really good job on. And now that there's more and more web social networking sites and the like, integrating that information as distinct from just the general search engine results, I think, is a really big and important opportunity. I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
That's a pretty good list. That will keep people busy.
Yeah.
If you had one final thought to educators who have been exploring the new technologies and are looking at implications for education, is there anything you would want to say at this point?
I guess I would say have fun. The thing that you can do the most for your students is to share your own enthusiasm. And, that can be sometimes difficult if you have an unresponsive crowd. But boy, love is contagious and excitement is contagious. And if you care about a subject enough, your students will care about it. When I think back on my best learning experiences, they were always with teachers who were excited and passionate about their subject. And I remember I was on a panel recently with Thomas Friedman, and he gave a great piece of advice that he said was from an exchange with somebody who'd written him in a letter, or it might have been in another talk he'd given, but student said, I know that the new skill is supposed to be learning how to learn, but where do I learn that? And he said there's no courses on it, but just ask around at your school and ask who are the most exciting, most passionate teachers. He said, when you find that list, go take their course. It does not matter what it is. And I certainly found that to be true. When I had a course recommended to me, somebody said, "Oh, you're not going to believe this." I'm thinking this is college, not K-12, but probably my favorite course in college was "The Age of Johnson" by Walter Jackson Bate. I thought, oh, Samuel Johnson, isn't he this boring guy who did this dictionary back in late 1700s? That was about the extent of my knowledge. And I've been living off that course, in the 30 years since, because it was just unbelievable. It was exciting. And Bate was he was imbued with the subject to such a level and so much excitement about it. Similarly, I had a freshman Greek class with a guy who was Greg Naj, who's was a philologist and is just on fire with love of language. And those things make an impression. When I was in high school, I had this Latin teacher who was just, he was this pugnacious Jesuit, who just kind of created this sort of competitive, exciting atmosphere, in which you were asked to perform, what you knew, and it was incredibly exciting, and it made you want to learn more, and it's completely independent of subject.
Tim, thanks so much for taking the time today.
You're very welcome.
Have a great day.
All right, bye-bye.